Welcome back, ladies, to the Girl Power Alliance podcast. I have a treat for you today. I think this is an absolute first. This type of guest to come on the podcast, we have Tina Ramirez. Tina is running for the state Senate in Virginia. And I heard Tina speak at a women's conference in Anaheim, California at Influence Church, Orange County. And she really struck me with what she said when she got on stage. First of all, to have somebody be campaigning all over and to really be able to have that, I want to fight for religious freedoms. But not only that, she fights for freedoms, fighting for rights around the world, and she's committed securing them here at home so her daughter can grow up in an America that really reflects our values. And just with everything going on in the world, I was like, I'm going to reach out and see if Tina can jump on the show. And she got back to me really quickly. And so, Tina, we are so excited to have you on our podcast today.
Oh, thanks, Molly. It's great to be with you. I had so much fun at the church. Just with all the women, it was so much energy in the room. It was really exciting and just encouraging for me to hear all of them share as well.
Well, I mean, it's so encouraging for us to hear you share because we see all the types of politics that are out there. And, let's just be honest, we're not like, yay, for all the people that are out there running, right? But when we hear somebody like you, or at least when I did, I was like, here's a woman that is fighting for real stuff and really wanting to make a change. And it really all started, obviously, with your daughter. And there's a lot of moms that are here listening that I'm sure are going to be so intrigued by your story. But before we jump into all that, you got a pretty extensive background. I'd love for you to share a little bit about how God led you into a position like this.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a 7-year-old daughter, I should say. Her name is Abigail, and she is definitely like the little light of my life. I'm a single mom too, which I'm sure you have a lot of single moms on your podcast. And so I just want to be an encouragement to them as well, because I am a single mom and I run a business. And so my business is called Hardwired. And it's the idea that we're all hardwired to be free, and our freedom of conscience and our freedom to worship and believe as we choose is really one of our most fundamental freedoms. And so for the last 20 years, I've been in a space internationally where I've been defending religious freedom for all different kinds of people. And it's exciting for me to have been a part of just a lot of stories around the world where people were really suffering because they didn't have a freedom that we can so easily take for granted here in America, and to see firsthand what happens when you lose this freedom. And so when I did have my daughter, I think it really brought to home why those freedoms are so valuable, because every day I think of those stories, the people that I saw, and women like myself who had their children ripped from their hands, often at gunpoint by people that were attacking them simply because of their religion, their identity. And knowing that my daughter gets to grow up in a country where she has the kind of freedom that we have here has just really invigorated me even more to ensure that the freedoms that we have here in America are protected for future generations and for her. So as a mother, I come to this probably from a very different perspective than I did maybe when I was younger in the last 10 to 20 years. But now I definitely have different eyes to see it, and I can just approach it in a much different way. And so it's really kind of changed my outlook on religious freedom globally and how we're helping people.
How is taking that stance, in a corporate setting? Like, what have you had to deal with being, so concrete in that?
Yeah, so I got started about 20 years ago. I was a teacher in Orange County, California, so where you're based, and was teaching for about 4 years in the public schools. And I even taught human rights in the public schools and taught them about our most fundamental freedoms based on a lot of the constitutional values that they're rooted in. And I just had this urge to really begin to move into a broader space where I could help people firsthand that were suffering without the basic rights that we have here in America. So I ended up going to England and studying over there international human rights. Then I moved back to the United States and moved to Washington, D.C., where I got a job at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And so it's a government agency. It's, very bureaucratic, obviously, working in that space. And then from there, I went to work for the U.S. Congress, and I built a bipartisan caucus on international religious freedom there. And so when you ask me about the challenges or just what it's like to be in that space, I think that often people working in Washington are very much interested in their own agendas, their own careers, their own personal self-interest, and not really the interests of others. And so I went to Washington after having another career that was serving children and families, to want to serve people in a very different way, to make religious freedom really something that the United States was able to share globally as a fundamental value that we have here as Americans. And so I guess I went there with a different perspective, but it had its own challenges, because going into that space, everybody's climbing this powerful ladder of, trying to get access, to a higher position in power in Washington and in our government. And my ambition was never power or climbing some ladder, but just serving and helping people around the world that were suffering. And so it's interesting from that, how it led to my interaction with countries and the relationships I've built over the last 20 years, how different that has looked for me.
Gosh, that is incredible. I mean, it's so true. I mean, from the outsider looking in, it looks like that too. Everybody trying to climb the ladder, that power hungry, like just out for themselves. And that's why I was like, I cannot wait to have her on the podcast, because I could just tell the first time I heard you speak, you were really about how can I serve others and make this right. And so being in that space, talk about your faith a little bit. I mean, how are you able to stay so rooted in God in a place like that? Because I know for me, when I was in corporate, talked about a little bit being on the news, that was hard. Like being in an environment that was so toxic, of people constantly trying to blow out my light, so to speak, because of just everything that the world has consumed them. And so I'm so curious in where you're at, because I'm sure women are really wanting to lean into your answer right now, because we all deal with that in some regards, but where you're at, it can get pretty thick, I bet.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where your faith really grounds you, because I grew up just within the church community, going to a lot of the Calvary Chapel School of the Bible classes and learning apologetics. And when I was 11, my parents had divorced, and my dad became a Jehovah's Witness. And so for me, at a very early formative age, I was confronted face to face with my father leaving the church and believing something very differently. And he was evangelizing me, and I was basically reading all of these books about understanding what I believed and how to defend my beliefs at literally 11 years old. And so from 11 until I went through college, I went to Vanguard University right there in Southern California. I was really challenged to know what I believe, to be able to defend what I believe, and to learn how to interact with people who believe very differently, and to not be threatened by it, and to learn how to engage them with love, with respect, with dignity. And I think that really is what inspired me to go into international human rights, because when I saw people around the world that were literally willing to risk their lives to live out their faith, I thought, how could I be so weak in my own faith and not stand up for what I believe in, even here where I have the freedom to do it? And how could I then not stand up for them over there? And so it led me into that field in a really unique way, with a sense of compassion and respect for people that believe very differently. So I didn't just end up going and working for people that are Christian. I ended up working, both at the commission and in the US government, and even since then through my company, with people who believe all different kinds of things, even believe nothing. But because I truly believe, as part of my faith, that God has given us all the freedom to choose him or to not choose him, that religious freedom really starts with our foundation in our faith. And from that, I don't feel the need to pressure anyone or force anyone to believe, what I believe. I simply can present it and allow God to do the work. But within the space of religious freedom, I believe that God created every human being with dignity, that we are all created in the Imago Dei. And that's something that I can defend for all people. And with that Imago Dei that we all hold comes certain rights and responsibilities towards our Creator. And so I can share those through the trainings and the programs, the work that I do around the world, to help people to model, really, look, we should be treating one another with greater respect, love, dignity, and allowing them to have the freedom of conscience, of worship, of belief, even if they believe differently. And I know in many countries, religious freedom does not exist. It's a foreign concept. It's not rooted in their faith that people have the freedom to believe differently. It's actually rooted in a lot of different faiths that you have to believe what you're born into, and you have no freedom to change. And so, I think that a lot of my faith does very much influence my perspective of religious freedom globally, of human rights. And it's from that really God has allowed me to work in a space to be a blessing to so many people, even people that are not part of my faith community, and that's okay. I believe that we're all called to be witnesses in everything that we do. But the the top commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and then to love your neighbors as yourself. And so I cannot love my neighbors as myself without allowing them the same freedoms I want for myself. And that's what my life has completely been about, from, really the earliest years, where I had those conversations with my dad and had to learn how to do that. And so that's really, I think, been a unique calling for me, but it's something that I'm trying to transfer onto my daughter as well.
Oh, that's so powerful to like, I mean, one of the things that just stood out to me is that you're right. There are people fighting all over the world for their religious freedom because they have to. But here we don't have to. So, forgive me for saying it, people, but that could make us really lazy in our faith. I mean, like, let's just be honest. But you dove in at a very young age because you wanted to know, and you were like, hey, I got to figure this out. It's so similar to what my husband actually had to go through. Like, he at like 15 really dove into apologetics and this and that. I'm like, 15, like, that's so crazy. Like, why? Well, he didn't have a dad growing up, so he wanted to know his heavenly father. And so that was one of the things when we were dating early on. I was like, you're different. You're a unicorn. I got to snag you, right? So hearing it from somebody else again, it's amazing because you chose to dive in, and we all have the choice of how deep do we want to dive in order to be like, okay, God, how am I going to live out for you? Because the cost of following Jesus it's a high one, it's a very high one. And I love the fact that you're doing that not only for yourself. At 11 years old, you started that. You're doing it for your daughter. And then you're like, how can I do this on a bigger scale? Which I think is absolutely incredible, because sometimes we just get so caught up thinking, okay, it's just us, but really it's so much bigger than us. And so I would love to hear, like, in that pursuit of being able to fight for other people, I'm sure there's women listening to this being like, wow, I don't even know how she does it, but you do it because it's an intentional act every day. Talk about that intentionality of what you have to do, get to do, by just really grounding yourself to remind yourself of the work. Because I'm sure there's times where it's easier and times where it can get kind of tough.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that what I would share is that when I first started considering religious freedom, really understanding it, was, I think, around 1997. It was when I started college, and I read a book called Their Blood Cries Out by Paul Marshall, who's a good friend now. And he wrote this book about Christian suffering around the world. And so it was my first really exposure to how they were standing up for their faith and living it out and really suffering for it. I was also reading a lot of books about missionaries like Amy Carmichael and Elizabeth Elliot and so many others that just really, I think, expended themselves, gave themselves to serve others, to love others, to share their faith. And I do think it's something we can very easily take for granted in a comfortable country where we are not challenged in our faith. And in many of the countries where I work, people don't have the freedom to marry. They don't have the freedom to buy property or to get a job, even a job in the government. They have on their identity cards their religious identity, and all of their choices and freedoms are really dictated by their religious identity, because they're a minority in these countries, and they're often ostracized, discriminated against, marginalized in those societies. And so, or far worse, in North Korea, they killed down to the third generation of anyone that was associated with the Christian faith. So it really puts things into perspective when Christians have to live in other countries in such a way where they're constantly facing those kinds of obstacles, not having the most basic freedoms that we have. So that puts it into perspective for me every time. I think one of the stories that I will share is, and I alluded to it earlier, but when I was in Iraq, I was literally 5 months pregnant with my daughter, and a genocide had started across Iraq. And my company went in there because I had worked with many of the Iraqi religious communities prior to ISIS coming in, after the United States had gone into Iraq, and been working with them on religious freedom and protections. I held numerous hearings in the US Congress to find ways to protect the different religious communities there that were persecuted. And so when ISIS came in, they wrote to me and they were just like, please help us. What can you do? And so at the time I had started my company. And so I went there. I was 5 months pregnant, and I met a lady named Aida, whose 4-year-old daughter, Christina, was ripped from her arms at gunpoint by ISIS as she was forced out of her village. And she did not, she could not keep her child. She was literally ripped from her arms, and she had no ability to protect herself. And I remember sitting in the room, listening to her story, listening to what happened, crying with her, praying with her. And when I hear stories like that, and there's hundreds of other stories, there's so many Aidas, and there's so many other women and families like that are suffering every day, it grounds me because it reminds me of the freedom I have, but also the responsibility that I have to, one, steward my faith well, and to not be complacent, and secondly, to stand up for the freedom of others. And Paul said when he was in prison, to stand up for the rights of others, to remember those that are in prison as though we are in prison with them. And he was a Roman citizen. He had the ability to do a lot of things, but he said, no, when your brothers and sisters are suffering, you remember them, you stand up for them. He didn't often even defend himself when he was in prison, but he always said that we defend others who are. And so I that has always been a grounding kind of point for me in my faith and in my work. But I think also, going back to what I said before, I really believe that we have to come back to the fundamental principles as believers of what does the Bible say about who human beings are. Human beings are created in the image of God. They bear the imago Dei. They bear immense dignity, value, and worth, regardless of who they are, what they believe. And that is something that we can share with others that no one else can. So why not share that good news in a way that would hopefully lead them, to the faith that we believe will be life-saving for them. So
It's beautiful. I mean, it's heart-wrenching because, hearing those stories, you're just like, you hear about it, but you just sometimes just can't wrap your mind around that is actually happening around the world. And like, we do have like a comfort and a bubble here in the United States. I mean, we have our own problems, but pale in comparison to what other people are going through. Gosh, it's just like a little drop in the bucket. So that's just so powerful when you get those reminders of like, okay, God comes back and grounds you, being like, this is why I have you on this mission. And he'll even break your heart for what breaks his. And so you're so rooted inside of that. And that's definitely a prayer that I've been praying. I'm like, Lord, break my heart for what breaks yours. And then when I started feeling it, I was like, why am I feeling this way? I'm like, oh, well, be careful what you pray for. But he wants you to see things that other people just kind of move past. And so kind of bringing this back into, you running for the Senate position in Virginia, what you're doing. I would love for you to share, just any bits of that as far as like what that looks like, how people can support you, because we may have listeners on here that obviously live in Virginia, which would be great. I'd love for you to kind of, bring that back in, because obviously you have such a crusade on the world. And then, you're wanting to bring those freedoms here and have this America be the one that you value as well.
Absolutely. Well, my initial interest in getting into the political sphere, because I was always behind the scenes. So just, working for members of Congress, you're obviously in the government, arena, but I was serving members of Congress and constituents and just working very much behind the scenes. And a few years ago, I live in Virginia, and the district that I live in was, it flipped. So a Democratic woman came in to take the seat and was extremely, extremely liberal. She's, endorsed by NARAL. I mean, everything as far left as you can go. And yet she wanted to portray herself as though this is a great movement for women. Women should be okay with all of these values that she was presenting. And I didn't buy it. I said, no, that's not me. I've literally been fighting for the freedom and dignity of people around the world. And I happen to be conservative and have these values rooted in my faith. And I don't have to be a Democrat just because I'm a woman, or because I'm a single mom, or because I'm Hispanic, or anything else that they wanted to put on me. I have the right to believe what I want. I mean, everybody does, whatever party they want to be in. But I didn't like how they were trying to pit all women in a category. And with the policies that we've seen over the last few years, these are policies that are trying to take away our parental rights, that are trying to indoctrinate our kids in our schools, that are literally running the gamut of trampling on every fundamental value that I have. And I just said, that's not what I stand for. And I do believe it's important that we have women that can stand up and say that are professional, that have the experience and the expertise to be able to say, no, we need leaders that represent our values too. And so a few years ago, I put my hat in the ring for a congressional seat in Virginia, and it was against this woman, and I literally lost the primary by about 8 votes. And so that was in 2020. So 2022, I ran again and was the clear front runner. And then, as you know, everything is being redistricted across the country. And so my seat was literally carved into 4 or 5 different little pieces. And so I ended up being put into another Republican district and decided not to run, against that congressman for that seat. I wanted to ensure that, we could move forward. And the woman that I was going to run against had literally just left the district and decided to run somewhere else where she could be safer and continue to promote her liberal values. So I took a step back this year and decided that I wanted to stay in my district. I wanted to stay in my community with my neighbors. And so I decided to run for a state Senate seat right here in the community where I live in Chesterfield, in Virginia, and to be able to represent my neighbors. We've been fighting for the last couple of years on the crazy policies in education in our schools, particularly here in Virginia. I feel like we're kind of like at the front line of the battle for this, but I know that many other states have been in this battle as I've been traveling across the country and talking to people. And so I really felt like to continue the work that we need to do here in Virginia and nationwide on education and on many other issues, I wanted to stay in that arena. And so I decided to run for the state Senate seat, and your listeners can go to tinaramirez.com to learn more about that. But it's an extreme sacrifice for your family to do this. I don't consider myself a politician. I am, I'm a single mother. I'm a business woman. I run a full-time company. I mean, I've been doing it for the last few years, even while running. I'm here to serve people and to help people. That's what motivates me in my life. It's not, because I need to be in Washington or somewhere else. I don't. I really love what I get to do. And thankfully in the Senate seat, it's a part-time, position. So the state Senate isn't in session all year. And so I'll be able to really influence decisions that we need to have impacted here in Virginia, especially on education. I think everybody saw the win with Governor Youngkin last fall. And, it's definitely sent waves across the nation of what could be done, particularly on education, because I really think this was a victory for moms that have been fighting for our parental rights. And so I want to continue that victory here in Virginia and then nationwide, as God leads. So.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yes, it did send a lot of waves. And right when you said that, I literally had like goosebumps. I was like, I remember when that happened, and it was just, God's doing a thing. When you look outside your four walls, you're just like, wow, you can look at the world one way and have a perspective of, oh, we're losing all hope. And also look at it being like, hey, there's still people that are fighting even when you don't see it, because the media is only going to cover a certain portion, right? And that's where that was a big reason why I got out. I was like, this is horrible. Like, we're not giving like a fair agenda here. But being able to hear from people like yourself, where you're in it and you're seeing it. But I love what you said. You're like, I'm a single mom. I'm a businesswoman. Like, I don't consider myself a politician. I am just here to serve. And I think people can really resonate with that, because that's really, that's how I feel when it comes to like people that I'm voting for. Like, you are here to serve, but yet they're putting their agenda above. Before we wrap things up, I would love to touch on this. Like, what does your daughter think about all of this?
That's a great question. Well, whenever I'm about to give a speech or preparing something, she comes in and she's like, no, Mom, that's just wrong. You need to tell people why you're helping them and what you're doing around the world and how you're saving people. They need to know that. They need to know how you're helping people and how you're going to help them. And so she corrects me. She gives me speeches. I try to record them and she doesn't let me. So she's, my biggest cheerleader, my biggest critic, my biggest fan. I'm a better person because of her. And, I'm just grateful that I get to be a mom and a mom to my little rock star girl. So, she's a great support. She travels with me, sometimes to different countries, and she's a smart cookie. She'll, I took her a number of times during the governor's race to see Winsome Sears, who I was very supportive of in the governor's race. She's our new lieutenant governor. And I did that because, when Kamala Harris won last year, the election, everybody wanted us to portray, to put up Kamala Harris as the role model for young women. And I just thought, I know Kamala Harris's background, and I don't want her to be the role model for my daughter. I want her to see other strong women who live lives of integrity, of just that have lives that are committed to our fundamental values and freedoms. And I love Winsome for what she does. And so I would often bring her to the events. And, I know that the fight that I'm fighting right now, she sees, and she knows what it means to fight for your freedoms. And I talk to her all the time about the people that are persecuted and how they're suffering and what it means to have the freedoms that we have. And so I just think as parents, it's so important that we teach our kids, because the reality is this world wants to take them from us and teach them their ways. And if we don't do it first, they're going to be snatched up. And we've seen that with so many generations of young people. I talk to families all the time who their kids go off to college and it's like they come back and they're a different person. And so my first job is really to shepherd and steward my daughter and her faith and her values and her future. And so I take that very seriously. And, all of the other stuff I get to do is a blessing. I love it. I feel very fortunate, but she is my first priority.
I love that. I was like, you never know, you never know when you're just like, especially since I know she is like, obviously somebody that you're fighting for clearly, because you want to make sure that she has a world that, she can kind of either think for herself, figure things out, and really just have a good guiding light, because there are a lot of choice things that are out there that are wildly different from when you and I were both kids. And so I just think it's so important. And you said something really important, the win in Virginia, when the tides kind of changed recently, it was a win for moms. And, I hear this all the time. I'm not a mother yet, Lord willing, when that happens, it will. But you get moms that are upset and want to change something, they're going to change something, right? And they're going to come together and they're going to be like, no, this is not okay. And we've seen those instances when people band together being like, no, our voices need to be heard. We're done sitting on the sidelines letting somebody dictate our lives. Change really does happen. And the minute you stepped on that stage at that event in February, I said, you know what, like this, I need to have her on the show, because there's so much, like I heard so much humility, but so much just like gratitude. And then just like, just so much of a humble servant. And that is so incredible. And the fact that, obviously you're doing that for your daughter, you're doing that in your business, and you're doing that, for the nation, where at least where you're at, actually around the world too. It's just incredible. So Tina, I'm just so grateful that you're able to come on the show today. And is there anything else you'd love to say to wrap this show up? And of course, let the women know the best place for them to get in touch with you in case there is something, they want to donate, they want to support, or send a kind word.
Yeah, well, they should just go to tina@tinaramirez.com if they want to send me an email and learn anything more. But the last thing I'll share is that, during COVID, we saw religious liberty really come under attack here in our country. And I think you saw it. I mean, we saw it in Virginia, but you certainly saw it in California. And a lot of churches caved and didn't stand up, but a lot of churches did. And they really came under major attack from the government and had to defend their freedoms. And I just would encourage people, like, that is so important that you do stand up in those times, because the government is watching how far they can push to take away your liberty. And so it is important that you stand up. But during that time, I took I work with teachers around the world, and in Iraq in particular. And a lot of the teachers we work with develop lessons about religious freedom and implement it in their classrooms. So we took them and we turned them into stories, and we wrote children's books out of them. So I have about 5 different children's books on my website for my company at hardwiredglobal.org. And if they're interested in sharing these values of religious liberty with their children, I would just encourage them to go and to get these books and to share them with their teachers and their communities, because one really practical way that moms and parents can begin to change things is by engaging in that way and saying, hey, here's an alternative. I don't want you teaching that, but this is something that, is something that, is, why wouldn't you teach? It's part of our fundamental freedoms. And, we grounded it in international human rights. There's really no reason that you shouldn't support it. And I mean, they were modeled by people around the world that are literally fighting for the very freedoms that, over 200 years ago, our founding fathers fought for. So I would love for your listeners to go on and to get a copy of those books and to share them with their children, their families, and their schools and their neighborhoods, whether they're moms or not, because that is one really practical thing that we can do. And as I saw what was happening in California and across the nation with churches being forced to shut down over crazy policies, I realized that we need to learn how to defend our faith, and we have to teach it to our children, and we have to prepare that next generation. That's what I'm doing with my daughter, but I wanted other people to have a resource to do that as well. So I would, love to be able to share that with anyone that wants to email me, and I can give them more details, or if they just want to go on to Amazon or hardwiredglobal.org, they can find it there as well.
Beautiful. I love it. Yes. If you have something if you're like, this is something that's not so good, come with a solution. That's always a great plan, because otherwise people are like, well, what are we doing here? So I love that you've provided that solution. And Tina, again, thank you so much for coming on today. This has just been so enlightening. There's so much richness in just who you are as a person, how faith has really rooted you from such a young age, and what you're doing with it now around the world. And so we are so grateful for you to come here on the show and share that all with us.
Thank you, Molly. It's great being with you. And I look forward to hearing from everyone.
Awesome. All right, ladies, we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.